To start, we're going to have Stephen Smith, who's the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, kick us off. And then after, we'll be joined by report authors, Heather Ponin, as well as Maggie Schober, who are Energy Policy Manager and Director of Utility Reform at SACE, respectively. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So again, please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A box. Steve, we can pass it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And thank you to everyone that's joining in these really, truly unprecedented times. And I hope everyone is safe and doing well. First, I'm very excited to make some just opening comments about this very important report, Tracking Decarbonization in the Southeast. As Kate said, this is our second annual report. You're going to find some additional information in this report building on what we did last year that I think further helps clarify the picture. SACE, as a nonprofit that basically really works in the Southeast, that's our sandbox, that's our focus. While here is our mission statement, ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to work to reduce the environmental footprint of how we produce and consume energy, and doing it in an equitable and fair way. That's our organization's focus and mission. Having a report like this will really help clarify a lot of where we're going and beginning to sort of see the difference between sort of the rhetorical claims that are being made and what the science really demands that we do. Ultimately, it is the science that will determine whether we're going to bend the curve on the disruptive impacts that will come from climate change. And so getting the tons out of the air is critically important. Just talking about it, just setting aspirational goals, just claiming that somehow or another it's going to magically go away isn't going to work. We've got to constantly evaluate every step of the way what is happening, what are the real tons out of the air, and how do we get that done and make sure that those who are responsible for putting these emissions up, and both in the utility sector, and then you'll hear us talk a little bit about the transportation sector, we've got to all take responsibility for making sure that folks are held accountable and that we're getting those tons out of the air. So this is an important report. We plan to continue to do these on how to hold folks accountable. We welcome the fact now that in the Southeast, we have some of the largest energy producers in the United States, some of the largest utilities, most of them vertically integrated, and they are now beginning to set goals. We welcome those goal setting activities, but in the classic saying, talk is cheap, you've got to make sure that just setting these aspirational goals and putting out a press release, you've got to match those with actions. And you will see as both Heather and Maggie present this information, that some of the trend lines based actually on the utility's own planning documents is not necessarily consistent with some of their stated goals. And so we need to constantly monitor that, and we need to constantly advocate for the rhetoric to match that. In addition, we're seeing a lot of cities setting goals and these aspirational goals, and there's a need for there to be partnerships with the utilities and with activities in the transportation sector, all very critically important. Finally, I want to just say thank you to Heather and Maggie and Kate. Heather and Maggie really pulling this information together and working to get it. It's not an easy task to assemble all these multiple data points and going through these laborious reports and IRP documents and other things, and then presenting that in a way that is easy or easier for folks in the public and in other professions to really be able to digest and then turn that into useful information. Not an insignificant task. And so I'm proud to have them on the team and be able to work with them. And I think you'll enjoy this report. So at this point, I believe I'm turning it over to Heather.
Okay. Thanks, Steve, for the introduction. So I wanted to start off by briefly speaking about the scope of the report, since emissions can be a pretty broad topic. But the primary focus of the report is tracking decarbonization in the power sector. And so when we say decarbonization, we're talking about the transition of our power supply to resources that are emitting lower levels of CO2, or ideally net zero emissions. So therefore, we're focusing on the electric power sector or electric utility companies in the Southeast. And this report is reviewing emissions trends and how the different mix of resources contributes to historical and future carbon emissions. So in order to do all that, we track individual utility resource plans, or IRPs, integrated resource plans, as well as federal data sources like EIA and FERC. So this report is a pretty close reflection of what utilities have either reported to federal data collectors, or what they've planned and submitted to regulators through integrated resource plans. So for all those reasons, there are actually some topics that we're not including in the report, or that we're only very briefly touching on, and those are listed here. Okay. So moving along, I wanted to quickly go over the geographic coverage of the report, just so that it's more clear which utilities we're talking about. Our database covers over 400 utilities, so that includes everything from investor-owned utilities to municipal systems to EMCs. And as you'll see from the map, there's partial coverage of some states, but that's actually intentional, because we're focusing on utilities that all follow similar regulatory models. So in the Southeast, we mainly have large vertically integrated utilities, and in many cases, those utilities are regulated by state entities called public service commissions or public utility commissions. And so basically the distinction boils down to whether or not a utility participates in a competitive energy market. So one quick example of a utility that is kind of geographically close to this region but not included is Entergy Mississippi. And the reason they're not included is because they're part of MISO, which is an interstate electricity market. Okay, so getting into the emissions data, we're starting off by looking at electric utilities in the broad context of overall emissions. And the reason we're doing this is because it can be a little bit difficult to disentangle all the different contributors to carbon emissions. So to start off, you'll see that I highlighted two periods of time on the chart in gray boxes. So that first period of time is the 2005 to 2007 time period. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because many of the utility and city decarbonization goals that we mentioned earlier use a benchmark year or a baseline year sometime during this 2005 to 2007 timeframe. And we're going to talk about those goals later in the report, of course, or later in the webinar. It's also noticeable because you can kind of see that 2007 was the peak year for CO2 emissions for the electric power sector. But basically, on a regional level, the total annual carbon emissions have been dropping for the past decade. The primary reason for that drop is just the sharp declines in the power sector specifically. And one notable result of the falling emissions for the power sector in relation to the total is that the largest contributor of CO2 in the region is now the transportation sector. But as you can see, it's still pretty closely followed by the power sector. But this still has significance because, you know, things in the transportation sector, there's a little bit more interplay with utilities just because of the growing popularity of electric vehicles, which of course plug into the utility grid. Okay, so moving along. Next, we're looking at just the general direction that power sector emissions are headed. So we're highlighting some of the larger utility groups in the region. There are four main ones that we've highlighted. So that's TVA, Duke, Southern Company, and NextEra. And together, those four make up 70% of regional power sector emissions. As Steve noted, these are some of the larger utility companies in the country. And we've also lumped together some of the smaller utilities, but among those larger four systems, Southern Company is the largest emitter of carbon dioxide at present, and that's expected to continue in the future. Another thing to notice is that the gap between Duke and TVA is expected to tighten up by 2025. And as a note here, we're looking at the total million tons of carbon emissions. So this doesn't account for the relative size of each utility, but we are going to go into that a little bit later in the webinar. Okay, so moving down to moving up to the Southeast utilities total, one thing that's pretty notable is that the decline in emissions that we've seen during the past decade is kind of tapering off in the near future. And that's driven primarily by things like coal retirements and other changes to utility generation, which we're actually going to look at in the next slide. Okay, so now we're looking at the resource mix. So that's the combination of resources that makes up generation. And let's see, so we're looking at the regional total, but of course, this varies from state to state and utility to utility. And at a regional level, 90 to 95% of generation has historically come from coal, fossil gas, and nuclear. In 2012, the top fuel for power generation in the region shifted from coal to fossil gas. And that shift of the top generating fuel is really interesting because power plants tend to stay around and contribute to the generation mix for a long time, decades. But if we actually go back and look when they were built, we get a clearer picture of just how much things can change over time. So that's what we're doing now in the next slide. Okay, so this is a snapshot of currently operating and planned resource capacity. And so we're showing it by resource type and the year it was built or it's expected to be built. And I just think this is really interesting because it does a good job of showing how utilities can kind of have a favorite resource type or a go-to, power plant type for new generation, but that really shifts over time. So going all the way back to the 50s and the 60s, we have coal plants that are as old as 60 years old, still in operation today. And then you also see during the 70s and the 80s, nuclear really pops up sometimes. And then going along to after that, and especially in the early 2000s, we just see utilities building lots and lots of gas plants. And one of the reasons for that is because of the high load growth. Utilities were expecting to need to produce lots and lots of electricity for their customers. But over time, that's changed. And so at present, utilities are actually showing low or flat load growth. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about in the next slide. But you can also see that at present, solar is forecasted to add lots of capacity. The investments really aren't slowing down. And I think that's something that you can see a little bit easier in this slide. So again, that low or flat load growth is something that you can see a little bit easier here. So let's look at the fossil fuels first. So by 2030, about half of the generation of the region's generation is going to come from fossil gas. There will be some coal usage still lingering. We could see more retirements, but as of right now, current utility plans show that there is going to be continued usage through at least 2030. In terms of renewables or clean energy, so in the report, we group clean energy as energy efficiency, wind, and solar. But in terms of clean energy investments, again, solar shows no sign of slowing, and there's lots of additions up until 2030. Future updates might reflect new opportunities for wind, which we don't see a lot of right now, just because utility resource plans don't frequently evaluate in-region wind or offshore resources. Okay, so moving along, now we're looking at how much CO2, pounds of CO2 relative to how much power each utility generates. This measure is called carbon intensity or emissions intensity. So basically, when consumed, different fuels emit different amounts of carbon for each megawatt hour of electricity that's produced. And as a reminder, for those of you who don't read a lot of charts, in this case, a lower emissions intensity number, the bottom of the chart, is more desirable, just because the lower emissions intensity means that that utility or state is using cleaner energy. Okay, so back in 2010, the regional average was 1,120 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. But now we can see that this regional average is closer towards its 890 pounds per megawatt hour. So we've seen a pretty significant decrease already. And another interesting thing is that that Southeast average 890 is actually coincidentally just about the same emissions intensity as a combined cycle plant. Another insight here that you can see is that there's a pretty big range in emissions intensity, from up at the top over 1200 down to almost 600 at the bottom. So because of all that variation, we're going to break this down a little bit further into just states and utilities in the next slides. Okay. So now we're looking at just the states. Down at the bottom, you can see North Carolina is the cleanest state at present, with the lowest emissions intensity at 663 pounds per megawatt hour, although the state of Tennessee is a very close second at 674 pounds per megawatt hour. And notably, further towards the top, the Florida utilities are still among the most emissions intense in the region. This is due to, again, the high reliance on fossil gas, with some coal usage still lingering. But another insight about this chart and about Florida is that there's actually a lot of diversity in terms of emissions rates for the utilities within Florida. So we're going to continue to break this down further by utility. Okay. So up at the top, you can see that the three highest, or the most emissions intense utilities, are Gulf Power, Duke Energy Florida, and Alabama Power. So lots of coal and gas usage there, which explains the higher emissions intensity. And then down at the bottom, I'm actually going to just quickly highlight 4 utilities because they're clustered fairly closely together. So we have 2 Duke utilities. We have Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas. So those both operate in the Carolinas. And then above that, we also have TVA and Florida Power and Light, which are clustered below the Southeast regional average. One additional insight here before I hand this over to Maggie is about the relationship between some of these companies. So some of those larger utility systems that I mentioned earlier, Duke, Southern Company, are actually made up of multiple operating companies. So to provide a quick example, that's why you actually see 3 different Duke utilities here. And this actually matters a lot when it comes to utilities reaching their decarbonization goals, because all the different operating companies are, so they can be in different states, so they have to deal with different resource planning processes, and an individual operating company might end up differing significantly in terms of emissions because of the way those processes are laid out. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Maggie Schober, who's going to take us through some of the challenges that utilities face with resource planning, with decarbonization, as well as just general trends in those utility groups that I just mentioned.
Great, thanks, Heather. All right, so now we turn to the question, where do we go from here? One key first step is obviously recognizing the need for decarbonizing the power grid, and therefore setting a goal for when we want to get there. This is a long-term process, so having interim steps along the way are helpful check-ins to make sure we're on the right trajectory. And it's really important that goals reflect both the science and look at overall emissions, instead of looking at just an emissions rate that fails to adequately address the overall problem. So we see many utilities and also local governments in the region have already done that. Here are 4 examples on the screen. But you'll see on the next slides that it's one thing to set a goal and it's another to put action behind that goal to make it a reality. It's a lot easier to say you're going to reduce emissions by a certain amount, but the harder work comes in figuring out actually how to do that. And we've seen study after study showing that decarbonization is very doable. But then the necessary work, hard work comes next. That how do you actually get to a plan that gets you to meet this very important challenge. And the alternative of doing nothing is just not an alternative. So we're going to go through the 4 largest utilities in the region and what they're doing. We're starting off with Duke Energy. As Heather mentioned, a lot of these utilities have, are overarching companies that have multiple utilities across the region. So Duke has 3 utilities in the Southeast, 2 that serve both North and South Carolina, and 1 in Florida. And Duke has probably the most ambitious goal of these large utilities in the Southeast, and it is well on its way to meeting its interim goal in 2030. And we can see here that from the chart on the right that most of the emission reductions are occurring in Duke's utilities in the Carolinas. However, it is concerning that this utility is, quote unquote, the best of these in the region, but it's still very far off track to decarbonize over the long term. You'll see on the left, this chart is where we chart emissions from utility plans in the red line. And they tend to level off, beginning around in the 2020 to 2025 timeframe, so very soon. And that is opposed to the green and orange lines, which show, where we need to go to get to full decarbonization by 2040 to 2055 timeframe, which is where, the science tells us we need to be headed. Now, one note on Duke before we move on to the next utility is that Duke is set to release its updated future plans for its 2 utilities in the Carolinas next week. So that is an opportunity for them to get closer to being on track with their long-term goal. But we will just have to, wait and see what that looks like next week. So then on the next utility we have is Southern Company, which, like Duke, has an overall corporate goal of decarbonizing over the long term as well as an interim goal. So they, have set the goals, but also, like Duke, they are meeting their interim goal, and then emissions level off, and they remain off track with meeting the long-term goal. One way that Southern differs from Duke is that we don't have an immediate expectation for a new plan that would potentially put one or all of Southern's utilities on track. Mississippi Power is the next of these, of their 3 utilities that's going to file a future resource plan, and that's expected later this year. This is the first time that Mississippi Power has done, has filed an IRP since the state put in place integrated resource plan rules. But we will see what that plan looks like, but we do not expect that it will materially change these charts. As you can see on the right, the Mississippi Power piece of, overall Southern's CO2 is a smaller portion compared to Georgia and Alabama. And then we move on to NextEra, which is a company that is often known across the country as one of the largest developers of renewable energy, but also the owner of 2 regulated utilities in Florida. And their decarbonization path is not much better than its peers. Despite having a lackluster goal that's only a near-term goal and focuses on an emissions rate and not overall emissions, the 2 regulated utilities are fairly close to where they would need to be to get to net zero by 2040. But again, they're not, their emissions are leveling off, and this long-term decarbonization is far from a reality. Part of the reason for this is that NextEra, as much of the rest of Florida, relies heavily on gas. And as Heather mentioned earlier, you can get some emission reductions from replacing coal with gas, but these reductions will bottom out at some point because gas is still emitting carbon dioxide. So then we ask, how do these 3 large investor-owned utilities compare to the country's largest public power utility? And so next is the Tennessee Valley Authority, and or TVA. And the TVA has seen some of the steepest emission reductions over the past decade. There are 2 main drivers of this. First, they had, historically had very high usage of coal, so they had, a lot of emissions to reduce. But another main driver is that TVA has seen, one of the largest reductions in demand for electricity overall, compared to most utilities across the region and across the country. And similar to other utilities, we do see TVA's emissions leveling off. We actually see those leveling off pretty much from here on out, 2020, 2021 timeframe. This could be because TVA doesn't have a formal carbon reduction goal, or it could also, it's a combination of that with the fact that this utility's action on solar has been lackluster to date. And similar to utilities in Florida and other states, TVA also has plans to add new gas power plants to their system. So now that we've gone through these 4 main utilities, where do we go from here? How do we move forward and put pressure on them, to improve their plans and really go for decarbonization? So the first, I'm going to go through 3 opportunities that we talk about in the report. The first I'm going to talk about is resource planning. This is the process that each vertically integrated utility goes through to decide what power plants to build or retire, just to make sure that it meets future demand. And it may be obvious, but the future resource mix is a big driver of future emissions. And to date, utilities have not taken advantage of the resource planning process as a way to really push for decarbonization and put forth portfolios or combinations of resources that meet long-term decarbonization goals. But we see the resource planning process, for instance, the resource plans Duke will file next week, as an opportunity for utilities to model the way that they could meet their own carbon goals, or set carbon goals based on the science and start planning for a decarbonized grid and start that planning process today. As a side note on this slide, we've also seen analysis out this week that changing the system and making utilities compete on cost represents an opportunity to reduce emissions. A competitive energy market model is not considered in this report, but this report serves as a good example of a business as usual case that can then be compared to some of the competitive models that were explored in other reports that were released this week. And then another opportunity for emission reductions ties power generation in with another sector, transportation. And electrification of transportation is a huge opportunity to reduce overall emissions in the region. As you saw earlier, transportation has now surpassed power generation as the largest emitting sector in the region. And it goes without saying, but it's definitely worth repeating that the cleaner the grid that these electric vehicles are plugging into, the greater the emission reductions we gain from electrifying this sector. And finally, one more opportunity we'll touch on today is action at the local level. We are already seeing cities across the Southeast set policies to reduce emissions or similar policies such as moving to 100% renewable energy. It's critical that utilities, both large and small, work with these cities to make plans that reflect these goals. And as you can see here on this slide, even as these policies are put in place, it's a popular opinion across the region that local governments should be doing even more about climate change. So these are just 3 opportunities that we felt were worth highlighting as they relate to power generation emissions in the Southeast. And obviously there are more than those, but we will focus on these 3 for now and then close by looking at the big picture. So this chart it's similar to the ones we saw on the utility pages, but it looks at the entire region. Again, this red line is where we are headed based on current utility plans. The green and the orange lines are where we need to get to in order to limit temperature rise to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So we are clearly off track. But as we talked about here, we do have many opportunities to get this sector on track. That's something that SACE works on day in, day out. And we hope you'll follow our work and join us as we put pressure on regulators, utilities, and policymakers to bring this red line closer to where we need to be. And with that, I think it's time to open it up for questions.
All right, thanks Maggie and Heather and Steve for starting us off. Just a reminder that if you have a question, to submit it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have a lot of questions, so if we do not get to your question, we can do a follow-up email with you. We also, I'd like to remind you that we will send out a recording to this webinar as well as the slide deck following the webinar. But to start us off, this question is for Maggie. There's an argument made that the Southeast lags behind on clean electricity transition because it is dominated by a non-restructured model of regulated monopolies. But we see states like Ohio also effectively resisting renewables in spite of being in restructured markets. Would you have any general comments on that? The advantages of each model when it comes to clean electricity penetration?
Yes, all right, thank you for this question to start us off. This is a good one. I think that competitive markets are a way to drive the clean electricity transition as the question states, but it is an instance of both, the devil's in the details and also that state policy really matters. And one thing that we see now is that renewables are incredibly cost effective. So if you're having generation technologies compete on cost, you're seeing renewables generally just win out. But if market rules are set up in such a way that is designed to disadvantage technologies, that's essentially putting the finger on the scale. And we have seen that in places like Ohio, where the state government passed a massive subsidy for coal and nuclear power plants in the state just last year. So all of these things matter, and it's not just one silver bullet that's going to get us there, and also that we need to be paying very close attention to how these things are implemented.
Thanks, Maggie. This next question is for Heather, kind of on along the same vein. As investor-owned utilities announce plans to decarbonize, can their investors hold them accountable to those plans, perhaps through a Securities and Exchange Commission?
Okay, I had to unmute. So I think the answer is ultimately yes. So one interesting thing to note is that last year in 2012, it was actually a group of investors in pension funds. They sent a letter to the top 20 largest publicly traded electric generators in the United States. So I believe that included Duke and Southern Company. And that group of investors actually asked for detailed plans to achieve carbon-free electricity by 2050. So I think we are starting to see that happen. As for the Securities and Exchange Commission, I think that they have actually discussed climate-related disclosures in the past, but I think that also recently there have been some rollbacks related to that, because the last time they discussed them in details was in 2010, but I'm not really sure about that at the present.
Okay, thanks, Heather. I've got another question for you. Will you be attempting in the future to add an assessment of methane emissions?
So the answer is yes. The methane emissions can be a little bit difficult to track, just because they can vary a lot based on kind of the age of the gas pipelines and infrastructure. So older systems are a little bit leakier. And to my knowledge, most utility systems don't actually report what their leakage rate is for those fugitive emissions. So I know that in Southern Company's kind of climate plan document they put out, they actually do report that. But for the other utility systems, it would require a little bit more guesswork. But yes, we're planning on attempting that in the future. And I think it'd be particularly interesting for states and utilities such as Florida, which are super gas heavy. So including those fugitive methane emissions and their CO2 equivalents could up the emissions intensity considerably.
And along the same vein, we have another question to ask. For electric power, are we pretending, quote, natural gas methane is better than burning coal, like the EPA says?
So no, we're not pretending it's better. And I think that the report does a little bit better of a job of this, which I know we didn't go over this chart, but I'm going to talk about it anyways, that we show kind of the fossil fuel emissions from coal and gas. And we're actually at the point now where the carbon emissions from fossil gas, so the question has natural gas in quotations, and that made me laugh, and I totally agree. One of the things in the report, we actually tried to switch the term that we use to fossil gas, because calling it natural gas really just obscures the fact that you're still burning a fossil fuel. And so with all these utilities adding so many gas plants, we're actually at the point now where emissions from those gas plants are almost even with coal retirements.
Okay, thanks, Heather. This next question is from Maggie. Are there any remote sensing instruments on in-orbit satellites that provide independent measurements of CO2 emissions and whether or not goals are being achieved?
All right, thanks. This is an interesting one. So I know that NASA has a plan to put up a satellite for this specifically. I can't remember the time frame for when that's expected to be up. But along that same lines of what Heather was just talking about, there's already a satellite up that's looking at methane emissions, because those are a little bit harder to track. The carbon is a little easier because it's coming out of the stack. And that's the way that we utilities are tracking this and reporting it to agencies like the EIA and the EPA, and that's where we have pretty good data on CO2 from power generation. But for the methane question, I think this satellite is a new and interesting way to look at that issue and track methane emissions more closely.
Okay, pivoting over, we have a couple of questions on Vogtle. Acknowledging the costs and delays once Vogtle 3 and 4 are online, will that lower Georgia Power's emissions or carbon intensity, or is it not expected to replace coal or gas power?
I can talk about this one.
I think
Yep.
that question is for Heather.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, going back to the report a little bit, just reconstructing this question as is the generation that's expected from Vogtle reflected in the report? And the answer is yes. So, even despite the delays, we are expecting that if and when that power comes online, that that would lower the emissions intensity for Georgia Power and also the state of Georgia. And the plant was approved back before some of the recent coal retirements were announced, so it doesn't necessarily replace that generation.
Okay, and Maggie, this question is for you, still on the topic of Vogtle. This woman wrote in and said that she's a former nuclear worker and worked at the Vogtle 3 and 4 construction sites. There is an excess of power in the Georgia power grid right now. When Vogtle 3 and 4 come online in 2021/2022, there will be an additional 2,234 megawatts of power. How can we ensure that the aging fossil plants that litter Georgia will be taken offline?
Thank you, an excellent question. So we agree that Georgia Power will be long on capacity after Vogtle comes online. And I think that the questioner has it exactly right, that it is an opportunity to put pressure on the utility to retire aging fossil plants. And that's definitely something that SACE and others in the clean energy and environmental community will be pushing for. So I hope you all will join us in that push. But that's also, the fact that Georgia Power will soon have a lot of excess capacity and generation is one of the reasons that I think Southern Company has been pushing what's called the Southeast Energy Exchange Market, which is going to be a way for utilities, these vertically integrated utilities across the region, to exchange excess power that they have amongst themselves more quickly than they're able to now. I know it has the word market in its name, but it's far from the markets that we see in other parts of the country. But I think that the excess power that Georgia Power expects is one of the key drivers for Southern Company to be a part of those discussions.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. Next, we're going to pivot over to a question about carbon pricing and removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Is that an option? And that question is for you, Maggie.
Yes, I think that is, that these are all options that are on the table. We really focused here on state and local and regulatory ways, that opportunities that are available to us through state regulators, state policymakers, and at the local level. And carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidies tend to be talked about at the national level. There are some state and regional carbon pricing regimes, but most fossil fuel subsidies are through are federal in nature. So I think that those are definitely opportunities for further decarbonization. And also I'll note that when this ties into our discussion of resource planning, because it is typical for these utilities to assume a $0 carbon price in their base case when they are planning for the future. And as I've observed, when you're looking at potential future carbon prices, they can go anywhere from $0 on up to hundreds of dollars per megawatt hour or per ton. And in that sense, assuming a $0 carbon price is an extreme assumption and is not preparing these utilities for a world of where there is a carbon pricing regime. And when utilities are looking out, 20 to 40 years, the likelihood that that there is no carbon price, or that it remains zero for that entire time, is, in my opinion, a pretty extreme assumption.
Pivoting over to a different option other than carbon pricing, do you see residential rooftop solar taking hold in more Southeast states by 2030?
I certainly hope so. Yes, I think that it can. I think, we're seeing the cost of solar continue to decline, and that is becoming more and more, an option for local residents, as well as small businesses. We're seeing utilities put forward community solar options. So I think that the options available are expanding. I think that utilities are, finally recognizing that some of them, not finally, some of them have recognized, a while ago, but more and more utilities are recognizing that their customers do want this choice option, and the value in having distributed solar throughout the grid, I think is only going to, become more and more obvious. And so by 2030, I think we should see a whole lot more of that across the Southeast.
Kate, let me jump in just a second, because I think the question had a component talking about rooftop solar. We are seeing a very negative trend where most of the southern utilities now are taking a much more hostile position to customers that are putting solar on their own rooftop, and they're being much more aggressive about trying to undermine opportunities for customers to do that. They're coming up with frames and talking about how customers who put rooftop solar on their house are not paying their fair share, and this kind of others. And so we're seeing lots of negative utility action against customer-owned solar, versus a lot of the things that Maggie talked about, which are things like community solar and the utilities themselves putting solar up to where they're owning or pushing the solar electrons out onto the grid in the sort of a more traditional fashion, as opposed to customers who own their own solar and wanting to get a fair compensation for, say, any excess generation. So I think it's very important that the collective, all of us are pushing back against the attempts for some of the larger utilities to sort of put their thumbs on the scales and try to come up with ways of undercutting customer-owned solar. And that's a negative trend that we're seeing, whereas utilities who own the solar, they're getting more comfortable with putting more of that out.
Thanks, Steve. And there is kind of a theme in some of these questions that's asking, what are some direct actions that folks can take in order to help get us on a path of decarbonization, rapid decarbonization? Backtracking a little bit, we had a question about, would you please talk about what net zero is? So Heather, it would be great if you could just dive into a little bit about what net zero is, and then I think we can collectively answer the question, what are some actions that folks can take in order to help put pressure on to get us on track for decarbonization?
Yeah, sure. So I think that one of the distinctions for these utility goals that can confuse people is that net zero sounds really close to zero, but it's not quite the same thing. So when utilities are saying that they want to achieve net zero, that still can leave the door open to some emissions, but they're then balanced out by removing carbon from the atmosphere in other types of ways. So one example of this is that Southern Company's decarbonization goal was originally styled as low to no carbon. But they actually transitioned to net zero. And so I think in their report, they actually said that would allow the company to still emit, quote, some carbon emissions, but that they would, quote, wash out their effects by removing carbon in other ways. And so I can't remember off the top of my head which types of ways they talked about, but Carbon removal is pretty broad. It can include things like reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. But there are also some direct air capture and storage technologies that I think are getting more popular.
Yeah, I would jump in here and just say that you have a really broad spectrum of decarbonization activities. Obviously, these major players like the utilities are making multi-billion-dollar decisions over long planning horizons that are going to get huge amounts of carbon out of the air if the decisions are made correctly. And then as you come closer and closer to your individual life, there are things that can happen. One of the important concepts that I think needs to be discussed more, and I think all people who are concerned about this really need to sort of be going through a checklist in their own personal life if they really want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, is what can you do to do effectively two things. One, be as efficient as possible in your energy use. And there's just a whole plethora of things that you can do on an efficiency basis, because the greenest electron is the one you never use. And, just being able to sort of minimize your overall impact. The other concept is something that is effectively, we need to electrify everything sort of concept, which is there's lots of things in our life where we are, as individuals, using fossil fuels. Probably the most dramatic of that is our modes of mobility using cars. And so seriously looking at decarbonizing your transportation as much as possible is an important thing, and looking at electric vehicles, which SACE and others are really leaning into, because those technologies are rapidly moving forward, and the driving experience is superior. The maintenance, the overall cost of ownership are much, much better, and we're going to see just a flooding of different electric vehicle models onto the marketplace. But even moving closer to your home, little basic things like, are you using an electric lawnmower versus a gas-powered lawnmower? Where are all the things that you interface with some form of fossil fuels, and try to electrify those? Are you using gas in your heating? Are you using more efficient electric stoves for cooking or for home heating, for hot water, all kinds of things like this? And so I think that as we all look at this decarbonization concept, there are the macro things that we need to be pushing for the larger industries and utilities to do, but we also need to sort of go through and do an individual audit of where we are using carbon. And as we begin to decarbonize and electrify more and more, again, the grid, it becomes more and more important for us to actually have more renewable energy and low to no carbon technologies on the grid. So these are really important questions, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there in just basic consumer education, and then each individual, taking those kind of personal actions that get us further and further away from dependence of these carbon emissions.
And Maggie, I'd be curious to hear from you if you could talk a little bit about some things maybe that we're working on at SACE on a macro level to promote decarbonization. FICA in Florida comes to my mind right away.
Yeah, so we're working through, local and state, regulatory and policy means to really work towards decarbonization and push these, utility plans towards, decarbonizing the power sector. I think Steve's recommendation is really great generally, but when we're looking at this report, if we're looking only at, the power sector, as you mentioned, these are large, long-term decisions that are made by utilities. And, I think the best levers we can pull are to, get involved and, organize and work with groups that are already in this space, like SACE and many, many others across the region. Get involved at the local level, get involved at the state level, and even, send comments and track what's going on and talk to your representatives at the federal level. I think those are all so important because, when we do that, policy can be put in place that really can shift these plans in a, meaningful way.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks, Steve, as well. I think we have time for one more question, and it kind of just goes back to the heart of the report. The question is, why are carbon reductions expected to decline in the future? And that could be, for Heather or for Maggie. Feel free to answer that.
Okay. Well, I think one thing that we have seen is, is that utilities have taken out a lot of the coal, put in gas, some of that for carbon reasons. Largely that has been done for economic reasons, just because it's the less expensive option, or was the less expensive option at the time. I think that it is important to hold utilities and states to further decarbonization, because the easier stuff, not that it was easy to get a lot of coal plants retired. I'm not going to pretend that was a walk in the park, but now that we're at this point where we've seen gas be described as a bridge fuel to get us to a clean energy future. We're at the end of that bridge from gas. We're switching over. We need to focus on renewables. Energy efficiency plays an absolutely key role in this, from a emissions perspective, as well as keeping rates stable and customer bills affordable. And utilities are not necessarily subject to policies that are really holding them to decarbonizing beyond this 2020 to 2025 timeframe, and so they aren't. I mean, the utilities are going to respond to both price signals and policies that are in place, and we need to make sure that both of those are telling them to decarbonize.
Yeah, and Kate, I want to just say something here that I think is critically important, and not to be at all partisan, but I just think it's just a fact. Those policies are determined largely by policymakers who are elected, and people have got to bring their understanding and motivation to move this issue into how they vote. It is not at all a secret that we are looking at some very, very different approaches to this in this election cycle. And so if you want to see decarbonization accelerate, and you want to assure that we're going to see the proper downward trajectories that science say we need to do, people need to engage in the electoral process in really meaningful ways, and they need to hold elected officials and decision makers accountable. That is a key piece of the puzzle here. And in our region in particular, we don't have the kind of leadership in a lot of the elected voices, and we need to weigh in some of the really critical races from the federal level all the way down to local government level through states. And so there's the way to get decarbonization locked in and committed to is to have decision makers and policy makers that are in place and are actually driving the agenda so that the utilities and the other players are actually responding appropriately. It's just a huge, huge part of the overall equation.
Thanks, Steve. I think that we're over time, so we'll go ahead and wrap the webinar. We did not get to everyone's questions. We thank you for asking questions and for joining us today on this really important webinar and discussion. We will send a follow-up of the recording as well as the slide deck in the coming days. If you haven't already, you can go to our website, cleanenergy.org/blog, and you can take a look at a companion blog that Heather authored. I think that wraps us up. So thank you guys for joining us and have a great day.
Yes, thank you, everybody.